So the work that active bystandership does, it brings in a third option for police officers, a much better option, and that's where we intervene early before something needs to be reported. If we act early, there's nothing to report. If we act early, there's no wellbeing crisis. If we act early, there's no mistake. So for me, it's a much better option. And over the last 4 years, I've seen US policing, having trained loads of officers across your country. I've seen a real embracing of the program. For me, it's a training that I wish I'd had as a young cop. You know, we've all witnessed poor behaviours, mistakes, and if you're a rookie, if you're maybe a subordinate officer, it's blinking hard to speak up, isn't it? Really hard to speak up, and because that risk of being disloyal, going against the team. So what I'm starting to see in the US is this is a good thing. When you intervene early, you're helping a colleague. You know, think of the pension, right? We're helping a cop go home. We're helping a cop go home to their family. That is a good thing. And if I'm helping you, you're helping me.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Lifeline, offering a holistic wellness approach focused on supporting American law enforcement, promoting resilience, safety, and survivability.
Hello, and welcome to Precinct 444, the official podcast of the National Law Enforcement Museum. I'm your host, Josh Bronson. Today's episode, Beyond the Badge, Global Perspectives on Violence Reduction and Active Bystandership, features a powerful conversation with Graham Goulden, retired Chief Inspector from Police Scotland and an internationally respected voice in violence prevention and culture change. Graham has spent his career helping law enforcement professionals understand the deeper social and psychological drivers of violence, especially male aggression, and how officers can become proactive agents of change. We'll explore how policing cultures around the world are evolving and how active bystandership, emotional intelligence, and community engagement are reshaping the role of law enforcement in society. So with that, Graham, we've known each other for a few years now. I think we met first back during COVID, since everything was virtual, of course, and made it easy given that you're in Scotland and I'm in the US. So I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the podcast today.
It's great to be here. I can't believe, I think it was like, it's 5 years now, Josh. We've known 4 or 5 years we've known each other. So yeah, it's good to be here. And thank you for the invite to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, happy to have you. So maybe I think it would be helpful for our listeners if we start off with just a little bit about who you are and your journey and what led you to where you are today. So if you can share a little bit about that journey, what led you to focus on violence prevention and culture change?
Yeah, I love that use of the word journey because it has been a journey in the last, 38, nearly 40 years. So I joined policing in Edinburgh, so Scotland's capital city. So in the UK, I live just south of Edinburgh now, but I joined Lothian and Borders Police back in 1987. I was 19 years old. If anybody listening has seen the first Train Spotting movie, I don't know if that's a thing in America, Train Spotting with Hugh McGregor. That was my beat. You know, it was a very busy time for drugs, violence, and maybe that's where I started to think about future roles, but not back then, because all I was doing there was just catching fish. It was just, going out there and arresting the baddies, I suppose. So I spent my early years in policing on the beat, just walking the streets, picking up work all the time, very, very busy. And I remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, just going out there and just doing, I was a plainclothes officer for a few years. I was a detective in Edinburgh for about 5 or 6 years, but I started to get really frustrated. And here's why, because I remember saying to myself, am I really making a difference? Am I really making a difference? I found myself arresting the same people and then their children. And I suppose I started to think, I can do better than this. So I had a little bit of time out from crime fighting, so to speak. And I was an instructor at our academy. So I was a sergeant instructor at a police academy, teaching the next generation of new recruits. I suppose I was teaching them to catch the bad people as well. So at that time, my lens hadn't really changed. It was about you break the law, you get arrested, and so on. Came back to work in Edinburgh. And then 2009, I applied for a job with the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. And even during the research for the job, which thankfully I got, I found myself being really challenged about my very narrow lens around criminal justice. Back then I thought the only way to deal with violence was to arrest people, but that means waiting for things to happen, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You've been there with people listening to this, wait for things to happen. It's like playing whack-a-mole. And when I got the job with the Violence Reduction Unit, my boss, my manager at the time said, Graham, stop thinking as a police officer, start thinking as a human being. Mm-hmm. And he was right. So I started to look at violence through a public health lens, which moves our focus from who's responsible to, we need to focus on the who, that's important, but to why, what? Why is this happening? What is contributing to violence? Back in 2005, Scotland had horrific levels of violence. We were, I think Glasgow was the most violent capital city in Europe. We looked at our death table. Here's a thing for listeners. When you break it down at a population level, we had 7.4 deaths per 100,000 people. Right? You're probably thinking, whoa, what does that mean? So we have 5 million people as a population in Scotland. America had 7.9 deaths per 100,000 people. Okay, you're a much bigger country, but you can see how that scared the living daylight out of us. We're thinking, what is going on in Scotland? So, we really started to look behind the act, started to look at the early years, the impact of early years trauma. Again, not excusing people for any violence or behavior, but really trying to understand where can we interrupt it. And that was, I started to look at the role of bystanders as well. Imagine if Scotland where we trained our society to nip things in the bud quickly. Where friends take friends away from harm. In the US, that big campaign you used in the 1980s, friends don't let friends drive drunk. Yeah. A very successful campaign because it led to, I believe, 68% of US citizens taking car keys off their friends. So you apply that, friends don't let friends get arrested. Friends don't let friends get involved in fights. Friends, you can go on with that.
Yeah.
You can keep going on with that. So I started to introduce some American programs into our high schools. There's a program in America called the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program, the MVP program, which was created in Boston in the 1990s. We love the evidence base around it. And I put a kilt in it and brought it to Scotland. Didn't change it a great deal. I just loved I sort of looked at a model from a friend of mine now, Alan, who was at the time a teacher in Sioux City, Iowa. And he'd been building this model in schools, really using the relationships amongst young people to help friends be better friends, but using it as a way to talk about domestic abuse, to talk about bullying, to talk about sexual violence. And, on the backdrop of Columbine, he introduced this program because his other option was more metal detectors at armed guards. And that ain't a good mix for learning, is it? So he started to look at the relationships in schools to try and deal with things quickly. So I've been retired from policing now 8 years. So I spent my last 8 years in the Violence Reduction Unit. I retired in 2017 and taken this bystander concept, which hopefully we'll talk a lot about today, into different workplaces, law firms, public bodies, universities, private business as well. I started working with you just during COVID, doing some culture change work with the campus police. And on the back of that, I was approached to work with Georgetown University in Washington to deliver the ABLE program, Active Bystander for Law Enforcement. Love that program. Probably one of the best trainings I've ever experienced and now deliver. And 2 or 3 years ago, I thought to myself, we need to do something in the UK. So I pulled all my knowledge of bystander theory and practice and built a program called As One, which is really just about helping police cultures come together and sort things out before it becomes the messy complaint, the messy headline in the paper. How do we help officers just take friends away from harmful situations? So yeah, that's about me, Josh, and fire away with your questions.
Yeah, no, and I think that's, it's helpful context for everybody listening to hear, the work that you've been able to do, that you've been a part of, the problems that you saw. I mean, you're right. I mean, even in the US, I remember back in I was born in 79, so I'm, just a little bit younger, but I remember, growing up in the 80s and 90s and hearing stories about Glasgow of all places and just how rough a city it was and then to see some of the changes that have occurred over the past years, where people go and it's, they're every place has problems, right? But
Yeah.
it's not nearly as bad as it used to be, and it's cool that you got to play a part in that.
Yeah, no, I think, just to give you some context as to where we are now, back in 2005, we had 159 homicides. For the last 10 years, it's been sub 50.
Wow.
There you go. So the
Yeah.
approach works. The approach works. And we just got to keep doing more and more and more of it.
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the things we want to sort of focus on today is, what does work? And, we've thrown around the word bystander a lot and bystandership a lot so far even. So what does that mean to you? The word bystander, bystandership.
Well, many people listening to this will, if you haven't done the ABLE training, if you're police law enforcement, you haven't done ABLE training, a bystander is often simply defined as a person standing by watching, doing nothing. That's a dictionary definition. And when you start to apply the science of active bystandership, basically what we're talking about within a policing context is reducing harm. Harm from misconduct, behavior, aggression, harm from mistakes, and also harm from well-being. Yeah, wellness, well-being is a major issue in policing, and poor well-being leads to mistakes. Poor well-being leads to bad behavior. And I think just now, it's something I say in all my trainings with police officers, and really any organization who has a code of ethics, code of conduct, like policing has. And in the US, you have a duty to intervene law, don't you? Every US
Mm.
state, you need to intervene if a colleague's breaching somebody's rights. And I think just now police officers have two choices when they witness harm from bad behavior or mistakes or whatever. And the two choices are not great choices. Choice one is to do nothing. And in the US, you God, you go to jail for that, don't you? Let's look at the Derek Chauvin, his colleagues. They're in jail now for simply not stopping Derek Chauvin. So that's why it's not a good option for cops to do nothing. Choice two is to report it as per your code of ethics, code of conduct, or you intervene as per the law. And why isn't that a great option? Because we all know as law enforcement, this code of we don't rat out our mates. We don't, it's changing, I get that, but it's still very much on your mind. You run the risk of being called the snitch, the telltale. There's a good old Scottish phrase called the clipe, the person who just tells on their friend, right? It tells on a colleague. But the word rat's used a lot. You hear it in American movies, and it just seeps into different things. That risk is there. So the work that active bystandership does, it brings in a third option for police officers, a much better option, and that's where we intervene early before something needs to be reported. If we act early, there's nothing to report. If we act early, there's no well-being crisis. If we act early, there's no mistake. So for me, it's a much better option. And over the last 4 years, I've seen US policing, having trained loads of officers across your country. I've seen a real embracing of the program. For me, it's a training that I wish I'd had as a young cop. We've all we've all witnessed poor behaviors, mistakes, and if you're a rookie, if you're maybe a subordinate officer, it's blinking hard to speak up, isn't it? Really hard to speak up, and because that risk of being disloyal, going against the team. So what is really what I'm starting to see in the US is this is a good thing. When you intervene early, you're helping a colleague. Think of the pension, right? We're helping a cop go home. We're helping a cop go home to their family. That is a good thing. And if I'm helping you, you're helping me. So it's really redefining what it means to be a loyal colleague. We talk a lot about brotherhood, family within policing, and it's just simply redefining it to having the courage to speak up.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I mean, I'm looking at an image right now, even of the memorial, the National Law Enforcement Memorial, and as you're talking about, keeping officers safe, and
Yeah.
whether it's from themselves or from other factors, but at the end of the day, it's about going home and not being on, in our case here in the US, on the memorial wall. Like you don't want to ever have to live through that, as putting your family, into those positions and things like that. And obviously it happens, and it's tragic, and we just, we can all do more to sort of prevent that. And this is one of those ways. I mean, I'm reminded back to early in my career, watching a supervisor mistreat, a suspect that, he was angry at because he ran away from him. And being a new officer, didn't know what to do. Right. And then fast forward to, as an acting supervisor, an officer overreacting to, being hit with a paper cup and trying to charge into a situation because they were hit by a paper cup, and needing to physically intervene in that situation, protecting the officer from themselves, right? And that didn't mean that I was going against the any sort of perception of law enforcement family, right? It meant protecting that person from themselves. And he was very grateful at the end, once he calmed down, for intervening.
And that's what we want to get across in these programs, is that if I speak to you, I'm doing it because you're my mate. And let's face it, you've talked about, officers who die in the line of duty. Way more officers die by suicide in the US. Right. And that's fact. That's something we're seeing a lot of big issues of well-being issues here in the UK. And officers often spot the early signs, early signs of burnout, fatigue, but we often leave it, don't we? We leave it until something's really obvious because we're scared to step on someone's toes. We're scared to get it wrong. We're scared we might lose a friend. We train for the physical aspects of policing, but we don't train for this stuff until now. And that's what active bystandership allows police departments to train their officers in, for the emotional stuff, to deal with high levels of trauma, to be able to overcome the stress that you're facing. So if you're not doing ABLE just now, folks, go and find it, because it's a fantastic program, and you might meet me from Scotland training it. I totally believe it.
There you go. Another incentive to look for that. So, in the introduction, and this ties into sort of being a mate, like you said, for your peers. I think one of the things that we don't talk enough about, and it's not an indictment of men. I want to preface this with that statement, because I'm a man. You're a man, right? And so it's not an indictment of male, of being a man or masculinity, but there is a lot of research around male aggression, especially younger men as they're growing up. But then certainly, like I mentioned, the officer that overreacted to the paper cup, right? I mean, not being able to sort of put together that wasn't intended, at him. It wasn't a slight at him. Where do you see that coming into play with all of this, and tie in active bystandership, but also the male aggression sort of piece?
Yeah, let's apply it out with policing. So you're right that most violence in this world is committed against men. Fact, we know that homicides, assaults, whatever, men are the victims of other men's violence. That's a fact as well. Most violence is committed by men against men. You start to look at, domestic abuse. You look at sexual violence. Again, men feature as they are victims, usually of other men's and some women's violence. But predominantly, we're talking about young women and young girls, women in general, victims of men's violence. And you're right, Josh. We're guys, and I'm not here today to point fingers. What doesn't work with this stuff is telling men not to do things.
Yeah.
Right? Or bad things will happen to you. Josh will come and arrest you if you do something bad. What does work is just correcting misperceptions, focusing on the good things. Most men in the United States don't commit violence. Most young men at Northeastern University ask for consent before they have sexual acts take place. And that's not my words. That's social science. That's the social norms approaches, Alan Berkowitz, who started to look at the need for us to focus on the positive. It's much better to focus on the positive as opposed to the negative. And what that does is it looks at men as the solution. And that then brings in the bystander approach that I use in my work with policing and outside policing, is a really good way to bring men into the conversation. Esther Sola, I think one of your educationalists in America many years ago, said what turned the tide in addressing domestic abuse in the US was inviting men into the conversation, not indicting them. Far too often we point fingers. And I can understand the frustration. I can understand 2025, levels of sexual violence taking place, domestic abuse, women are frustrated. Surely by now we should be dealing with it. Things are improving, but I can understand the frustration. And what Esther talked about many years ago was just bringing men into the conversation. And one of the best bits of advice I got was from another American, Tony Porter, who heads up a call to men in the US. And he said to me in the UK a few years ago, meet men where they're at. Meet men where they're at. Don't lecture them. Don't dictate to them. So bringing men into the conversation is really important, because what that allows you to do is to get men talking. You start to help them see the healthy norms that exist amongst the vast majority of men. And then we can give them the tools and strategies to be able to speak up. About 3 years ago, I helped Police Scotland build a campaign called Don't Be That Guy. And there's actually a US version of it that we did with Futures Without Violence. And really what we wanted to look at was this idea of male sexual entitlement. Focus was on young men between 18 and 35, because that's where our risk factors are when it comes to sexual violence. And step one was to help them make the connection between early behaviors and rape and sexual assault. Sexual violence starts long before you think it does. And you'll find that guy online. There's some really good resources there. And the second part was, let's move to a more strength-based approach. And we just had 4 ordinary guys in a room being filmed, talking about how they feel when they hear a friend behaving badly, using derogatory, misogynistic, sexist words. And then just the idea of calling your mates in. Don't shout at your friends. Maybe they're doing it for a number of reasons. Maybe they don't believe it, but they feel they have to, because we know that happens as well. Often young men wrongly perceive what their friends think, and they think they have to behave in certain ways. And we see a lot of that in policing, don't we? Harvard many years ago talked about masculinity contest cultures that exist in male-dominated, organizations and teams, military, police, sports teams as well. And often young men wrongly perceive what their friends think, so they join in with the behavior, or they're silent. And we're living at a time just now where we need more men with that moral courage to speak up. Women have been leaders on this stuff for decades, not just helping other women and girls, but helping young boys as well. How many young boys live in domestic abuse relationships and they're exposed to the trauma? So we simply need more men to just have that moral courage to be able to, hey, Josh, why are you saying that? And what that does is it just creates a tone for your peer group. And here's the kicker. Most guys want to do this. But unless we talk about it,
yeah,
we ain't gonna know.
Yeah, we don't know how, right? We've never been taught. And it's the same way in policing, right? We're told you need to intervene in a situation, but then nobody ever tells us how. Like when you're a new officer, like I mentioned, I didn't know how to intervene in that situation. Yeah. Was I going to be in trouble, with my supervisor then? What were the consequences? I wasn't thinking in those terms, right? And I think anybody in policing has you've been through something like that. And I think that's the real challenge, is that we expect people to intervene, to be active bystanders, to engage their friends, and yet we never teach them how to do it.
No. And but we need to give people tools and strategies, but we also need to create permission.
Yeah.
I could give you all the tools in the world, Josh, but if you don't sense permission from your peers, you won't speak up. And that's what's often missing from bystander type approaches in universities or schools or police departments, where like here in the UK, I get frustrated that a lot of policing organizations give out that half hour, that 1 hour e-learning training on bystander techniques for dealing with sexual harassment in policing. It doesn't work. You need to get folk in a room and, that's costly, Graham. Well, that takes too long. Okay, think about the lawsuit. Think about the officers who have been suspended. That costs you way more money than getting cops in a room. We need to really start thinking about building a culture that gives permission to officers, but also takes us back to why we join policing. And we join policing to help our communities.
Yeah.
And if we're seeing bad behaviours and if cops are struggling with well-being issues, then we ain't giving the best service to our communities. So leaders, there's some really good emerging evidence now around how senior leaders in police departments, and I suppose anywhere really, need to move from being task-focused to being culture-focused. Mm. Leaders are the architects of culture. Mm-hmm. And, if you get culture right, people will do the job. The task will be completed. But just now, law enforcement, I think, is losing officers in the US, losing officers here in the UK who are resigning, leaving the job early, not because of the exposure to trauma in the jobs. It's because of the culture that they're working in. They don't feel safe. They don't feel supported. And I don't mean just supported by their leaders. They don't feel supported by each other. Policing has lost its community. And we talk about a policing family. I'll be very honest here. I think policing has become a very dysfunctional family. And maybe I'm talking from the UK here. We just don't look out for each other anymore. We think we do. But if you're allowing a colleague to lose their job, to struggle with their well-being, you ain't looking out for your colleague. And there's reasons for that. And that's what leaders need to start to unpick.
Yeah. Well, you talk about policing, and policing is such an interesting profession, right? Because there are a lot of professions out there that sort of purport to look out for each other and take care. And by and large, I think police officers do want to do that, right? They do want to, and your point is definitely well taken. I mean, policing culture has changed. You talk to anybody who's retired recently and they'll tell you about all the changes that have occurred in policing. But I agree with that. Like, I believe in the nobility of the policing profession. I believe that people get into this work because they have the best of intentions and want to help people, to your point. And I think very often, again, to your point, leaders fail them along the way without giving them the proper tools to really succeed. I mean, you talk about intervening in situations, right? If we taught people better how to, the root cause, what are the root causes of violence, right? And we empowered them to help interrupt those things, the way that we would expect they would do in their agency. But what if they were able to do it in their communities? One of the most frustrating types of calls you hear over and over again is domestic violence calls, right? Where you're going back to the same house over and over again, right? And there are plenty of other types of calls like that too. But what if we gave law enforcement the tools to actually interrupt it and not just respond, right? And actually be part of the solution in those cases, and giving and empowering them to help people the way that they want to be able to help people. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, you talked about domestic abuse there, Josh, and there'll never be peace in the streets to be peace in the home. If you look at the impact of domestic abuse, the trauma it does create and can lead to, lesser life outcomes for kids who grow up. Think about violence in communities. Often the backstory is people escaping domestic abuse. You've got a big issue around drug deaths in Scotland. Although we're doing well with other issues, big issues of homelessness, drug deaths. If you go back the way, BLE is trauma, childhood trauma that's unresolved. So, my ask of police officers, if we start to attend domestic abuse calls promptly and we give them, the attention they need, could we reduce violence in the streets later on? And evidence is, yes, we could. It might take a long time to see it, but you can, because even I remember looking at some of the terrorist attacks in Europe in the last few years, and often behind the perpetrators was strict upbringing, patriarchal upbringing from certain communities, and abuse in the home was very much a reality. So will there be peace in the world until we have peace in the home? You could keep going with that as well. And I think if you bring it even further closer to home, even being that role model in your peer groups. Domestic abuse perpetrators are not monsters. What they do is monsters. They're ordinary people. And that could be a friend, it could be a colleague who might be doing something knowingly or unknowingly. And, apply that to police officers. We know that officer perpetrated domestic abuse is a big issue in the UK as it is in the US. So that then suggests if we start to spot the early signs of burnout, fatigue, could we, I'm not excusing domestic abuse in the home, but could that help that officer go home? And because who hasn't taken work home with them? Most of us don't go home and take it out on our partner, but we might get a bit grumpy with our partner or our kids even, and we feel really guilty about that. But also when we start to see, guys just role modeling pro-social, good behaviors, respect and kindness, even in the way they talk about their female colleagues or their partner, then that sends out a message that a certain behavior is not tolerated in this department and this team. And that has an impact as well. So I think it's really important that we think about our roles, our response to domestic abuse, but even our daily actions in our law enforcement teams, or even our peer groups, sports teams, because the biggest influence on individual behavior is not necessarily the individual, it's their peers. And if we see peers behaving respectfully in kind ways, then that will spread as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's about leadership, right? And when I say leadership, I don't even just mean leadership of a police organization, a chief, or it's seeing yourself as a police officer, as a patrol officer that's been on the job for a year, as a leader, right? And I think that's part of that shifting mindset, is that you are a leader in your community, or you have the potential to be a leader in your community and take on some of these issues and really make a difference.
Yeah. For me, I've spent my last, 15 years since joining the violence reduction unit and now in retirement, looking at violence through a lens of leadership. And what I mean by that, it's not about being in charge. You're right. It's not the chief or whoever. Think about the traits of good leaders. The traits of being a good leader. For me, a good leader is someone who's got the ability to show compassion and empathy, right? And for you to reach out to a colleague who's struggling with their well-being or is a victim of harassment or domestic abuse at home, you're showing compassion, you're showing empathy, you're being a leader in that moment. For you to maybe speak to a colleague who's maybe behaving in a bad way, inappropriately, you're showing moral courage. You're being a leader in that moment. And, being a good police officer is, you've got to be a good police officer, but first and foremost, you've got to be a good human being as well. And I think, a problem that policing has, I see it here in the UK, and I think it's the same in the US, is that we tend to, I think we recruit good people. In the main, I think we recruit good people with good values, good beliefs, with that desire to help people, help their communities. But see, in the first week, where we impose our values on police officers, where we all dress the same, we all do the same thing, we follow orders, and that's important. And in the UK, we have a sort of 2-year probationary period where, if you could lose your job at any time, right? And what that does is it creates clones, people who are scared to be their authentic selves. So they're scared to speak up. So that impacts on all the stuff we've been talking about, why people don't speak up in issues, and it stops people, I think, being the best version of themselves. That the All Blacks rugby team in New Zealand, better people make better All Blacks. Character matters. They've got this philosophy of no dickheads. It's a great philosophy. And it basically means that so their equation for high long-term performance is character plus ability. You might be the best rugby player in the world, but if you're a dickhead, they don't want you on the field or off the field. So character on the field, character off the field. And I think it's the same for policing. You've got to be good as a cop, right? But you've got to be a good person as well. And then going back to what you talked about, leadership. Leadership is a skill that can be activated as opposed to simply acquired. And I think the role of leaders in police agencies is to create more leaders. Instilling responsibility is the key for active bystandership to happen. When hey, Josh, I want you to speak to me if I make a mistake. I want you and the rest of the team to just to look out for each other if I'm a chief or wherever. Because when you give responsibility, when you make it okay, that the science says that will motivate people to act.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the All Blacks rugby team too. Some of what I'm thinking right now, going through my head, even as of athletic, sports teams, professional sports teams that sign a bunch of the highest priced free agents that they can possibly sign, but they never mesh as a team and they end up never winning anything because they're, and it's not to say that they're all bad people or anything that, because I don't know them personally, but there's definitely something to that, right? Where it's like the best talent don't always mesh. You have to have somebody that can then bring them together, instill that culture in them of winning, in this case, and what it means to be, a professional athlete. And it's the same way in policing, right?
Yeah, I remember I had a great opportunity about 7-8 years ago now to work. I was in the US with some colleagues in the US, and Major League Baseball teams. So, and I think, think of the O.J. Simpson event many years ago, the trial and stuff there. That led to a mandate in pro sports in America, football, NFL, hockey, etc., mandating trainings to deal with things like domestic abuse. And that year, I worked with the Cleveland Indians, the LA Dodgers, but the team that really impressed me, and my big baseball team now, is the Chicago Cubs. Joe Madden was brought in that year to win the World Series. They'd never won the World Series in their life, and that year they were going to win it, and they did win it, right? And we spent a week working with the team, focusing a lot on values. The Cubs way, the courage to do the right thing, the urgency to get it done, and the belief that I can make a difference. That's active bystandership. That is looking out for your mates. Distractions off the field become distractions on the field. And Joe Madden's mantra was, "What you give, you get back and more." And he turned that into the word respect. That was the theme that year. If you respect this, that will come back to you. And they won the World Series, and the rest is history. But you're right. Policing can learn a lot from professional sports in the US. Good coaches don't coach to win; they coach to transform, to get the best out of people.
Yeah. That reminds me, I mean, it's fictional, of course, but Ted Lasso, on Apple, where, he even talks about, he doesn't, there you go, believe. Yeah. He talks about, he doesn't care about winning. It's about, basically supporting the young men that he's, has in his, control, right? And his span of control, as coach, helping them become better people. And in the process, it creates a winning team. And once and you have to get people to buy into that, right? And it takes you through how he gets people to buy in, for anybody that hasn't seen it. But it's, I think that's a great example of what it means to be a real leader.
I think, you're right. And you talk about buy-in there. I think, it's important we get people to buy in, but also it's important we get people to believe in what you're doing.
Yeah.
When I joined the violence reduction unit, I was sold, even when I was preparing for the job, I wanted this job so badly because I just totally saw this is good. This is going to work. And, the strap line for the violence reduction unit was, what was it? Violence is preventable, not inevitable.
Mm.
So we had that, and we went out across Scotland communicating that vision. And I think when it goes back to law enforcement, that's the role of leaders, is to help is to support your teams, to be a Ted Lasso, to be there. Yeah, and we know that if you've not watched Lasso, he's got some demons, but thankfully the team then help him with that. And I think you mentioned at the start about emotional intelligence, about leaders being more self-aware out there, so they can then interact with their teams. Relationships are the currency of change in any team, any setting. So we need to really focus on building relationships.
Well, and this is going to be a Ted Lasso podcast now, but going back to what you just said about his sort of demons too. I mean, I think it's an excellent example too, where he does struggle with mental health. He does
Yeah.
struggle with anxiety. He struggles with depression, all of these things, and he does something that is very, unfortunately, stereotypically,
Yeah.
male in not seeking help, right? Thinking he can deal with it on his own. And then it's only when he's able to sort of admit that and go through, therapy and admit it to his team even, right, that he starts to really heal. And I think that that's also something that plays into all of this is that, quite candidly, that's not something that we, and speaking as a man who was a police officer, it's not something that we dealt with very well. And you talked about the number of suicides of in law enforcement and the epidemic there. And I think there's a lot to that, right? Where if we unpack some of those issues and we're able to address some of those things, we'll end up being better police officers, but we'll also end up saving police officers' lives.
Yeah. Suicides and mental health is a big thing for me. And yeah, I lost my dad to suicide in 2008, and I talk about it. I never talked about well-being before I lost my dad,
Mhm.
right? And try and shut me up now because what I've learned, I know, and I've learned so much. Um, because I remember in the days, the weeks before, because my dad he had a stroke about a year before. He got over the physical side of things. He was 64, got over the physical aspects, but clearly the emotional stuff was still there, and he was nearing retirement. So he was getting really worried about. He didn't need to worry, but I think the stroke had really sort of weakened him a little bit, and he went missing one Saturday, and he was found some months later. But since then, there's things I wish I'd said, done, asked the question. Anybody listening here, if you've got any suspicions that a friend, colleague is struggling, just probe. Hey, you okay? And if you don't get the response you want and it's still happening, hey, you okay? I've noticed. And you can start to escalate it. But a good thing that anybody can do, male, female, whoever, but men especially, is be vulnerable. I'm not a fan of campaigns that tell men they need to talk
Yeah.
because men don't need to talk. I don't need to. If I say to you, Josh, you need to talk, then what I'm doing is I'm taking agency off you. And human
Yeah.
beings don't like agency being removed. So I need to role model vulnerability. It's that idea what you promote, you permit. If I can promote vulnerability, I make it okay for my friends to talk to open up as well. So I think, yeah, as guys, again, it's the social conditioning that we grow up like that, the expectation, and it's killing us. It's killing men disproportionately to other people in society, especially in law enforcement, because we've talked about that. And policing is still very much male dominated. I know those things are improving in the UK and in the US, but we do need men in law enforcement to be thinking differently, to be acting differently. And that's a good thing, isn't it? It's a good thing to be looking out for your mates because you might
Yeah.
be having a problem one day and someone comes up to you and say, hey, you okay, Josh? Are you okay, Graham? And that's a good thing. If I'm not looking out for you, who's looking out for me? So yeah, all this stuff is totally preventable if we have that
Yeah.
courage to do it and leadership to do it.
Yeah, and it all ties back to the idea of bystandership, of reducing violence, right? And being able to, go into our communities if we can't take care of ourselves, of our friends, our colleagues. I mean, we can't effectively take care of our communities, and try to reduce violence. And I'm sort of wondering, you know, what what have you seen sort of in your travels around the globe here, in different areas when it comes to these topics that we've been talking about? What are some of the things that you've seen that are maybe different than are being done in the U.S., maybe some that are similar?
Yeah.
Because you've worked in the U.S. as well as
Yeah.
other places around the globe. So I'm just curious
Yeah.
about that.
I think tackling violence when we the violence reduction, we our strategy was like twofold. Part one was contain and manage, right? So that's law enforcement specific job is to deal with things properly, efficiently, swift, visible justice. So how do we, contain and manage levels of violence? But we know from decades of failure in criminal justice system that we cannot police a way out of this. And we cannot just keep locking people up in prisons. One thing I've learned about prisons in the UK, and maybe it's the same in the US, is that we tend to fill prisons up with people that we're fed up with, we're upset with. As opposed, prison's important, but prisons should be used for people that we need protected from. The real dangerous people. Those we tend to send to prison are the ones that we're upset with. And actually, they could probably be better rehabilitated in communities. So at the same time as containing and managing, we need to really start to look at long-term solutions. And that is not just the policing. That is bringing in lots of other organizations, agencies, community. Prevention starts in the community. So how do we empower communities to just speak up, look up, look out for each other, deal with things, with your friend, neighbors, domestic abuse? How do you have that conversation and try and deal with things and be that supportive person? And we started to look at, again, we learned a lot from the US. There was the Boston ceasefire program, which looked at gangs. And we did a version in Scotland where we brought gang members into our court system, not on an official day, but we'd have all the members sitting on one side of the court in the public gallery. Didn't have to come, but they were invited in, and some of them came along. And then the other side of for the official side, we had a sheriff, a judge who was in charge. We'd have the local police chief would come in and say, "Hey, we know who you are. We know where you live. Here's some pictures. We know what you get up to, and we will be out arresting you," right? But then we had a mother of a homicide victim talking about the impact. And we had some really, really emotional scenes in some of these courts. Some of these guys in tears talking about things. And then we had a medic, a doctor would come in and say, "Hey, see, when I'm dealing with violence, I'm not dealing with kids who've got disabilities or missing limbs or cleft palates or whatever." And then what we would do is we'd say, right, so the violence has to stop, right? We're going to police this, but here's an option for you. And the option was just support, to get people off drugs, to get people into education, into employment. We looked at the homeboy industries work in LA. I think homeboy industries at LA, Los Angeles. Greg Boyle was a Jesuit priest who started to create jobs for people coming out of prison. The best way to avoid the bullet is a job. That was some of his stuff that he talked about. So we started to look at employability schemes, because when people go to prison and people break the law and get convictions, it's really hard for them to get back in jobs. And what we then do is we just impact on them, their families, their communities. We fail to give people hope. Imagine you're living a life just now where what's the point in getting up? I'm not going to get a job, can't support my family. So we started to look at that. We introduced that successfully. My focus in the VRU was looking at bystander approaches. So again, I brought the MVP program from the States, brought it to Scotland, and it's still going strong, 15 years after we started it. Some really good evidence about what works. But what works is realizing that we can't do this all ourselves. We need people coming together, creating that flow. At this time of the year, you'll see the birds flying in that V formation. It's the most efficient way to travel. And if you think about that in this context, just people coming together and working together. So in the US, you've got organizations like A Call to Men, Futures Without Violence, doing really good work in sports, in communities with mixed groups, with male groups. So if you're interested in this type of work, check these organizations out, because they're doing some really good work. The MVP program is still going strong in some schools in Iowa, and they're still developing that leadership amongst young people. So there's some really good things out there. And here's the thing, we don't talk about the good stuff enough, do we? We talk about the bad stuff. Mm-hmm. Bad news sells the stories. It gets the votes. But it really solves the problem. We need to be focusing more on the positives, the good things that are going on in our communities. So if you're involved in policing, or you're involved in other types of work, listening to this podcast today, focus on the good things. Because again, if we focus on the good, then we create a norm that most people want to follow. And again, that's all backed up by science.
It's interesting you say that too, because it's something that I always struggled with in my days in policing was being thanked or bringing any attention to myself, right?
Yeah.
For a job well done, let's call it, right? And I think that's an interesting point you made, because I've seen this in other people too. It's not just me, where it makes us uncomfortable because, hey, it's just our job, right? We're going out every day. We're doing this, and I don't need thanks. I don't need, to bring any self-congratulatory, attention on myself. I don't want to be on TV. I just want to go out and do my job and keep community safe. And I think that sometimes that is to our detriment, right? Where we don't get to talk about the good that's being done in our communities, the good that law enforcement in particular is doing in our communities, where they are intervening and becoming more of a violence interrupter. And not just because of presence either, right? That there are agencies that are talking about things like trauma now and teaching officers about the impact of traumatization, not just on an individual, but collective trauma, generational trauma, these types of things. I mean, in my policing days, my early policing days, we didn't talk about trauma, let alone collective trauma or generational trauma. And more people in the law enforcement community are familiar with those terms now. I think that's a huge win.
Yeah. I think you talked about, praising people. Yeah. I would never expect the public to praise the work we do. But I think most people in society do like the work we do, and you will get people praising us. But I think internally we need to see more. And here's why, right? Because we talked a lot today about well-being in policing, and stress and burnout, fatigue is a big thing. And the stress, and some stress is good for you, right? Some stress is good. But see, when the stress is prolonged, extreme and unpredictable, that isn't good for you. I was in an event a few weeks ago with the US neuroscientist Bruce Perry. Dr. Bruce Perry did some work with Oprah Winfrey. He wrote a great book with Oprah many years ago. And he was talking about workplace, like corrections. I've done some work in corrections in the US recently. And he said that the buffer to high levels of stress that we've just talked about isn't necessarily the employee assistance program or the new sofa in the coffee room. It's the daily interactions you have with each other. So praise each other. If someone does a good bit of work, hey, that's a great bit of work you did yesterday. Because what he called these check-ins opportunities to people to talk, but also he called these check-ins therapy doses. Every time you check in with a mate, you're giving them a dose of therapy because you make them feel noticed, right? And don't underestimate these little interactions. Far too often, I think policing, I know here in the UK, but police leaders are very quick to refer people to wellness programs. What does that say to the person who's suffering poor well-being if my supervisor is just passing me on? You've basically come to the end of your skill set. You can't deal with me anymore. So yeah, you can still do that, but you need to really put the effort in these early stages where you might help that person open up earlier, where you start to give them that sense of connection, coherence. We need more social connection. Policing needs to go back to community. It needs to repair itself, I suppose, to give its best to the public.
So what gives you hope then, as we sort of start to wrap up here, what gives you hope for the future of policing? And, we started to dive into this a little bit just now, but I'm really curious about this because, so much seems terrible, right? And we do talk about the bad things so often, but what gives you hope?
The people. It's people, I read recently in the US last year, I think it was early this year or last year, policing was the only public body to improve trust and confidence. Right. And so, because that has been the big holy grail for police departments around the world, how do we regain trust and confidence? Think of the George Floyd murder. In the UK, we had the murder of Sarah Everard, the lady who was murdered by a serving police officer. And policing in the UK is really struggling just now because we're just playing whack-a-mole. We're waiting for the cops to do bad things and then whacking them down. And active bystandership, what that does is it allows policing to reduce the moles that need to be whacked. So help our people. I work with US cops all the time, and we're all human beings. We struggle. So we need to, but most of us want to do the right thing. So we need to really, really help our officers. Again, go back to what I said a little while ago. Leaders are the architects of culture. Leaders need to move away from being task focused and administrators to being culture focused, building culture. The type of work, how does it feel to be led by me? How does it feel to come to work? And that excitement that you get when you come to work, that we need to really get back to that. When I was a cop, I was excited. Every shift, I was excited. What's going to happen today? When I was in the violence reduction unit, I was excited. I worked long hours, but I loved what I did because I had that belief in what I was doing. So I think, we need to, and also leaders. So there's that. So the people are that gives me the hope for it as well. And I think just now in the world, with all that's happening in the world, we need, the public need good law enforcement, humane law enforcement, doing what's needed, looking out for people. You mentioned being trauma informed, understanding where behavior is coming from. Is so important as well. So just equipping our officers with the skills, with the qualities to be good quality police officers for from 2025 and in the future as well. That's what I think is as well.
That's great. And I think that's a good place to stop for today. I would love to maybe pick back up with some of the topics maybe we didn't have time to discuss, but I really appreciate you being with us and sharing your insights and experiences, sharing your own personal stories even. Your work really reminds us that policing isn't just about enforcement. It's about leadership, compassion, the courage to challenge harmful norms and do what's right. And as we rethink the role of law enforcement in society, conversations like this really help to illuminate the path forward. To our listeners, if you found this episode meaningful, please subscribe to Precinct 444 and follow the National Law Enforcement Museum for more stories and discussions that explore the heart of public safety. Until next time, stay safe and stay engaged.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.